Hello everyone, I'm Sam Aronow, this is Elections Israel, and it's that time again when I lay out the major parties contending for the 25th Knesset. If you're new to this channel, this video is where I discuss the major parties, their histories, ideologies, and leaders, and to that end, I think it's time for a refresher on Israel's political system. The Knesset is elected via a system called party list proportional representation. Whereas most English-speaking countries have individual members of parliament representing specific geographic constituencies, the State of Israel votes as a single unit for entire political parties, each of whom is required to publish a list of 120 candidates. How many of those candidates win seats in the Knesset is determined entirely by their party's share of the total national popular vote, provided that they win at least 3.25% of the vote, or the equivalent of 4 seats. While that 3.25% threshold is higher than it used to be, it's still a pretty low bar for entry. And as a result, the number of viable political parties in any given Israeli election is very high. Across all of Israel's history, the number of parties has ranged between 8 and 15. And no Israeli party has ever won an outright majority. In order to form a government, one member of the Knesset must be confirmed by a majority vote in the Knesset to become prime minister, which in practical terms means that the parties have to negotiate to form a multi-party coalition government. For all intents and purposes, this means that the president of Israel gives a leader of one of the parties a set amount of time to form a coalition. Inability to do so empowers the president to then offer someone else the opportunity, but since the Knesset is already in session at this point, it can simply vote to dissolve itself and initiate a new round of elections. This latter maneuver is what resulted in 3 general elections in a single year between April 2019 and March 2020. And if not for the emergency caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, it likely would have continued like that. Because individual politicians don't have to run for individual seats, political parties are always changing very fast. And that's no less true now, but certain factors have remained constant throughout the past 2 years that have enabled this deadlock to persist. Prime Minister Netanyahu is on trial for a laundry list of crimes and will not resign, but his base of support is extremely solid. Religious parties have severely alienated the secular majority, but enjoy a large enough base of minority support to play a decisive role in the formation of a government. And a large portion of Israeli Arab voters, disaffected with the mainstream parties, have thrown their support behind the joint list, which is too extreme to be accepted as part of any government by the majority of lawmakers, but large enough to prevent one from forming. Remove any one of those obstacles, and the formation of a government would be a non-issue. But take away a global pandemic, and these are just as much the defining issues of Israeli politics today as they've been for the last 10 years. My goal today is to outline the current political parties and their positions on those issues, as well as many others facing the country. First up is the Likud party, led by Benjamin Netanyahu. The Likud has existed in some form since Israel's foundation, and indeed arguably some time before it. Its original incarnation, Hatzoar, subscribed to an ideology called revisionist Zionism, which mostly revolved around issues very specific to the fight for independence that became irrelevant once that fight was over. The Likud itself largely came about as a merger of the conservative and liberal parties, and as a result was historically not that conservative. But over the previous decade, Prime Minister Netanyahu has moved the party further and further right, so the Likud is very supportive of continuing to privatize public assets and utilities, further deregulating private industry, opposing a two-state solution, and being indifferent to issues of religion and state. But, and I'm trying to say this not as a member of the opposition, but as an Israeli, the Likud party since 2019 genuinely seems not to have any discernible ideology other than personal loyalty to Netanyahu, keeping him in the office of prime minister no matter what, and specifically changing the law to immunize him as prime minister from criminal prosecution. So, who is this guy? Benjamin Netanyahu comes from a large, outspoken family of right-wing revisionist Zionists. Though not an American citizen himself, he was raised for a time in the United States. He majored in architecture at MIT and went on to receive a master's in business there. And it looked like that's where he'd stay. But in 1976, his older brother Yonatan, a very elite military officer who was seen as having the future in politics, was killed leading the famous Entebbe raid. After that, Benjamin got into politics, became a diplomat under the joint socialist-conservative rule that very much defined Israeli politics in the 1980s, eventually rising to become ambassador to the United Nations, from which he was able to slide very easily into the leadership of the Likud party. He first became prime minister in 1996, That election was actually quite an upset because the Likud party came in second place in that election, and while he had campaigned as a far-right firebrand who would tear up the elaborate peace deal that then Prime Minister Rabin had made with the Palestinians, once in office he actually expanded that deal. But he was also twice recommended by police for indictment, and while the Attorney General declined to hear that case, it was quite damaging to his political reputation, and he ended up losing power in 1999. But he came back in the 2000s, and finally in 2009 he became prime minister again, in another election in which his party didn't come in first place. Netanyahu didn't really attempt to resume the peace process after it had stalled with his predecessor, and as political winds have changed, he's tried to appear more and more as an ultranationalist. The degree to which this has worked is debatable, and of course he's now on trial, as well as there being a whole mess of legal jeopardy for his wife and son, who have a growing reputation for being the real power behind the throne and for being kind of violent and power-mad. For non-political trivia, Mr. Netanyahu was the first prime minister to be born after Israeli independence, and though he is now 71 years old, he is technically Israel's youngest prime minister, having first taken office at a spry 47. Now, one of the quirks of Israeli politics is that one doesn't necessarily have to vote for the Likud party to support Netanyahu, and probably the best example of that phenomenon is the party immediately to the Likud's right, Yamina, led by Naftali Bennett. While Yamina in 2021 is not itself an explicitly religious party, the history of religious parties is still important to understanding where exactly it came from. For most of Israeli history, there was one major party for non-Haredi religious Jews. It was called Mafdal, which in Hebrew is short for the National Religious Party, and initially it was not a particularly right-wing party economically or in terms of foreign policy. The original version of the party was literally called the Religious Center. But as the Israeli right became more politically viable in the late 1970s, Mafdal began allying itself more closely with the Likud and subsequently becoming more right-wing almost by osmosis. Eventually, Mafdal started losing a lot of its support, so in the 2000s it rebranded itself as the Jewish Home, a party which very deliberately positioned itself as being very religious, but also like ultra-capitalist to a degree that doesn't otherwise even exist in Israeli politics. Eventually, the leadership of the Jewish Home was taken over by a man named Naftali Bennett, who, as both a tech entrepreneur and a native-born American, was received very favorably by conservative Christian groups in the US. But even though he is religious himself, Bennett wasn't really comfortable leading an explicitly religious party, which he saw as limiting to his political ambitions, and formed his own party called the New Right, which then merged with the Jewish Home and another religious party called Tkuma to form Yamina, which quite literally means rightward. Today, the religious parties have all left Yamina, but Bennett's personal popularity, as well as his hardline commitment to ultra-laissez-faire economics, has persisted. What I'm kind of dancing around is that Yamina's most notable trait is that it's the only Israeli political party which supports the theory of trickle-down economics, and the only Israeli political party which supports union busting. Yamina also supports reducing the power of Israel's Supreme Court, annexation of the West Bank with permanent second-class citizenship for the Arabs living there. They call this a state-plus solution. At the same time, though, it's hard to tell how serious Bennett is about any of the policy positions he espouses. It's perhaps fitting that he's seen as a competitor to Netanyahu for the soul of the right, because it often seems like Bennett will do or say anything to increase his leverage over Netanyahu, just as much as Netanyahu will do or say anything to stay in power. Now, I've said before that so much of the deadlock in Israeli politics flows from the fact that ultra-Orthodox parties, despite having a fairly low ceiling of voter support, are just popular and powerful enough to make or break a coalition agreement, and Israel has two of them. United Torah Judaism is a party catering exclusively to Hasidic Jews, not all Haredi Jews are Hasidic, led by Moshe Gafni. It's worth mentioning that Gafni is replacing the previous leader, Yaakov Litzman, after Litzman resigned in protest of the government's anger over his past role as deputy health minister, in which he openly obstructed COVID safety protocols, as well as for his role attempting to help a Hasidic schoolmaster named Malka Leifer avoid extradition to Australia for 74 counts of child sexual abuse. UTJ essentially takes its marching orders directly from a handful of rabbis from very specific rabbinic dynasties dating back to the 18th century. It basically represents the most religiously extreme version of Judaism. In fact, despite participating in many Israeli governments past, UTJ is technically opposed to that government's right to exist, believing that only the Messiah can establish a Jewish state, and that the Zionist ideal of a self-establishing secular Jewish state is blasphemous. But on a practical level, UTJ's main role is to ensure that the government continues exempting Haredi Jews from otherwise mandatory military service, giving out exclusively Haredi welfare benefits, and attempting to force public services and businesses to comply with Jewish religious law against the will of the vast majority of Israelis. There's not much to say about this one. If you're not Hasidic, you have no reason to vote for them. Not necessarily so the next party. Shas, led by Aryeh Deri. Shas is an interesting party in that it highlights many of the misconceptions people have about Israel just by its very existence. First of all, most Jews who immigrated to Israel in the 20th century came not from Europe, but from other Middle Eastern countries. Most of those arrivals were part of what we would call the Sephardic tradition, and for the most part they were very politically marginalized for a very long time. Shas was established in the 1980s in large part as a response to this lack of representation. But in the way it expressed the desire for more Sephardic empowerment, it also exposed this weird, oft-overlooked phenomenon of anti-Americanism and anti-Westernism within the Israeli right. Shas's mission statement is to return the crown to its former glory, which essentially means stripping Israeli society of anything too European. But at the same time, that's kind of what the Zionist movement was from the start, so it starts to come off, and not just in Shas, as if certain elements of Israeli society view Western liberal democracy itself as a colonialist imposition. Through this messaging, Shas has marketed itself somewhat successfully as a kind of culturally affirming, economically populist party for a very particular type of urban, working-class wise guy. Think Staten Island for the Americans in the audience. It even gets a little bit of Arab support in every election. But in practice, it really is just another Haredi party, dedicated to securing the same special privileges that UTJ has built itself around. Shas's leader, Aryeh Deri, is probably most famous for having been imprisoned for corruption as a result of his activity as interior minister in the 1990s, only to return to the party again, become its leader again, become interior minister again, and be recommended for indictment again, though this time it hasn't gone anywhere. And at what we can reasonably call the furthest right, we have religious Zionism, led by Bezalel Smotrich. After seceding from Yamina, the Jewish home in Tecuma began performing so badly that not a single opinion poll showed them winning any seats. This shouldn't have been a surprise. Before the split, hypothetical polls actually showed that Yamina would do worse if they reunited with those parties. But it was a problem for Netanyahu, since the absence of these parties from the Knesset could make the difference between staying in power and presiding over yet another hung parliament. So, to improve their electability, Netanyahu facilitated a merger between Tecuma and two other parties, Noam and Otzma Yehudit, to form the alliance simply known as Religious Zionism. All three of these factions fall under the category of far-right religious ultranationalists, but each party specializes in a particular issue. Noam is a rabidly homophobic party committed entirely to suppressing any acceptance whatsoever of LGBT people in Israel. Otzma Yehudit is the Jewish equivalent of the Taliban. More specifically, it is the political party representing a handful of organizations, mostly involving the same people, professing an ideology known as Kahanism. In 1968, an American rabbi named Meir Kahane formed the Jewish Defense League, which presented itself as kind of a Jewish version of the Black Panther Party, a movement for self-defense against anti-Semitism. However, most of what the JDL ended up doing was targeting minorities and other Jews. At the same time, Kahane went to Israel and established the political party Kach, which was dedicated to transforming the country into an ethnically cleansed, expansionist, totalitarian theocracy. This movement was so repulsive to the Israeli mainstream that when Kach won a single seat in the 1984 election, the basic laws of Israel were amended so as to prevent it from ever sitting in the Knesset again. Since then, Kahanism has been the motivating ideology behind a large number of terrorist attacks, most famously the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, and Otzma Yehudit, which is the new political arm of this movement, is recognized by the US as a terrorist organization. But while Otzma Yehudit may be much more intimately linked to actual terrorists, the ideas they're running on are not terribly different from the other RZ members. Religious Zionism's leader, Bezalel Smotrich, is not only a resident of an Israeli settlement in the West Bank, but lives in a home that is regarded as an illegal settlement even by the standards of the settlements themselves. He is also an outspoken segregationist, homophobe, and theocrat. But there are opposition parties on the right as well. Back in the 1990s, there was a very large influx of new immigrants to Israel from the former Soviet Union. So large, in fact, and in so short a time, that an entire political party called Yisrael Beitenu was able to form catering to their specific interests. However, Yisrael Beitenu was eventually eclipsed by a much more conservative Russophone party called Yisrael Beitenu, led by Avigdor Lieberman. Generally speaking, those Jews who came out of the Soviet Union were much more skeptical of socialist and social democratic parties than the Israeli public as a whole. This has become much less true for those who have arrived more recently, having come of age in the shadow of Putin, and as a consequence, the party isn't what it used to be. But as a whole, they are also very aggressively secular, even by the standards of other secular Israelis. And Netanyahu's constant reliance on religious parties to form a government eventually led Lieberman and Yisrael Beitenu to enter the opposition, which is the main reason Israel's been in a political crisis so long. Yisrael Beitenu supports more economic privatization and deregulation, but also supports a strong social safety net and meaningful economic aid to small businesses. They support a two-state solution, albeit a weird idiosyncratic version that involves ceding populated areas of Israel proper, and they are fiercely anti-clerical. Lieberman himself has quite an unusual past for a major politician. He was born and raised in Moldova and immigrated to Israel in the late 1970s. He lives in the West Bank settlement of Nokdim, but has said he's willing to leave his home if it means peace. However, he has something of a history as a hothead, both in politics and personally. In 2001, he hit a child who had hit his son, and even as he's shifted toward the center in internal politics, he is a very outspoken supporter of Vladimir Putin, which for Eastern European immigrants of my generation is exactly the thing they were trying to get away from. Now, one of the running themes of the past several years has been Netanyahu co-opting the Likud into a base of personal loyalists, alienating his more pragmatic ideological peers but suffering no electoral consequences for it. And in all that time, no ideological peer has cast a greater shadow than Gideon Sa'ar. In late 2019, Sa'ar challenged Netanyahu for the Likud leadership, but lost very decisively. So finally this year, Sa'ar has broken from the Likud and established his own party, New Hope. If you're an American, you might actually have heard of New Hope because until recently they had brought on some consultants from the Lincoln Project. Despite being declared a radical leftist traitor by Bibi, Sa'ar and New Hope are running on a platform that is practically identical to the Likud's, back when it had one. But it does have some interesting quirks. Like many anti-Netanyahu parties now, New Hope proposes a term limit for prime ministers, and unlike any other party that I know of, they would like to change the election process to a mixed member system, whereby some MKs would be elected as local representatives and others would be elected via a nationwide party list. This is the system currently used in Germany, and while I do support electoral reforms, I really don't like this system. I'm sure we'll get into it if I ever do a video on that. They are opposed to a two-state solution, though Sa'ar himself has suggested a plan to partition the West Bank between Israel and Jordan. The idea behind New Hope's creation is that normal Israeli conservatives would no longer be compelled to vote for the Likud. But what has happened is that, despite everything they believe in, New Hope has ended up taking votes from centrist and left-wing voters who just want Netanyahu out and clearly don't understand how their own political system works. The clear takeaway from this is that Netanyahu himself, in spite of and in some ways because of the criminal allegations and associations, is the main draw of the Likud. Now, let's move on to the actual center, left, and whatever else. Currently, the most popular opposition party is Yesh Atid, led by Yair Lapid. To say that Yesh Atid is an economically centrist, anti-clerical party supporting a two-state solution would be accurate, but not very interesting, so instead I'm going to go into its history. Now, in Israel's early days, centrist parties were primarily associated with the right-wing opposition, and generally acted as spoilers for the predecessors for the Likud, which, as I said, formed through the merger of the conservative and liberal parties. But since the mid-2000s, centrist parties, especially Yesh Atid, have drawn support entirely from Israel's left, and this can probably be attributed to its leader. Yair Lapid is the son of Tommy Lapid, a journalist who later became the head of the old centrist anti-clerical party Shinui. Similarly, Yair Lapid was a TV news anchor and sometime actor before forming Yesh Atid, and perhaps due to his background has brought a message savvy and well-spokenness that hasn't historically been prioritized in Israeli politics. For this reason, Lapid was often compared to Barack Obama when he first formed Yesh Atid, and only for this reason. As an American, I don't think of Barack Obama when I see the middlingly intelligent son of a wealthy political family. Honestly, there isn't that much to say about Yesh Atid, and having been to some of their events, that's exactly how they like it. Now, in a world where Yesh Atid did not exist, the main competitor to the Likud would probably be the Labour Party, led by Merav Michaeli. The Labour Party is the current incarnation of the social democratic movement which dominated Israeli politics for its first 29 years as an independent country, and indeed dominated the provisional government for 29 years before that. Essentially, the Labour Party supports a strong social safety net, more economic regulation, less privatization, an end to religious coercion, and a two-state solution. It's your standard center-left party. And full disclosure, I'm a member of the Labour Party. As recently as 2018, the second largest party in the Knesset, but it's fallen on hard times due to a combination of catastrophic mismanagement, a total lack of messaging, and a revolving door of leaders torn asunder by vicious infighting over the course of this constitutional crisis. That infighting came to a head in the 2020 election, in which only 3 Labour MKs were elected, and its top 2 members, Amir Peretz and Itzik Shmuli, agreed to join the national unity government under Netanyahu. Ironically, because Labour has fallen so far, the vicious infighting part is largely over. Peretz and Shmuli are gone, and earlier this year, Labour Party members, which, disclaimer, includes me, overwhelmingly rallied around Merav Michaeli. Like Yair Lapid, Michaeli grew up in a fairly high-profile family and was closely involved with mass media. She did her military service as a radio news anchor, and her partner is Lior Shlein, who's kind of the Israeli equivalent of Jon Stewart. She's also an old acquaintance of Beto O'Rourke, apparently. But with that spotlight comes its share of controversy, deserved or not. In a 2012 TED Talk, she stated that marriage should be abandoned as an institution. More controversially, in 2009, she said that parents should not be willing to let their children be drafted into an army that doesn't care about them, though this is clearly more of a rhetorical statement about the Army's shortage of social and psychological services than the literal incitement to draft dodging that the Likud claims it is. No, the biggest controversy for Labour this time around actually comes from its number 7 candidate. Now, Labour is fairly unusual in that it allows all party members to vote not only for the party's leader, but for most of the candidates on the party's list. This time, we each got to choose 7 candidates we liked most, and with a few exceptions, the people with more votes got a higher place on the list. But the Labour Party also keeps spots on its list for sectoral seats. They're fairly high on the list, and they're reserved for specific representatives of different areas and ethnic groups. And for non-Druze Arabs, the top spot was won by a Jaffa-based documentary filmmaker named Ibtissam Mara'ana. That Mara'ana even chose to run on the Labour list is a bit strange, given that in the past she's made some deeply inflammatory statements about the Zionist movement as a whole, enough to get her temporarily disqualified from running by the CEC. Though that decision was overturned in appeal after she apologized for those statements. At the same time, her husband is Jewish, and a lot of the people in the party just say that she wouldn't have run to be a candidate for Labour if she still felt the way that she had in the past, so take from that what you will. Now, if ever there was a time for Labour to live up to its name, it would be now. In an unprecedented economic crisis, when none of the established parties are even bothering to treat economics as a major issue, Labour could easily recapture its old glory by rolling out a comprehensive relief plan. I don't know why they aren't, but an entirely new social democratic party is. The New Economic Party is also a social democratic party which advocates for a two-state solution, a strong social safety net, and a mixed economy. But it is different in 3 very important ways. Its candidates, led by Yaron Zalecha, are all economic specialists from academia who've never held national office before. It actually does have a comprehensive plan to resuscitate Israel's economy post-pandemic, and it hasn't gotten above the threshold in a single poll since party lists were finalized, so it has no chance of actually winning seats. But wait, there's a 3rd social democratic party in the mix, and you probably knew that. Yes, Blue and White, led by Benny Gantz, is still there, without Yesh Atid or Telem or any of the qualified candidates that jumped ship from Labour in 2019, barely treading water above the electoral threshold. Once upon a time, I could tell you what Blue and White's platform is, but now that the aforementioned Labour people have come home, I have no idea. This is a Middle Eastern country. If you're one of them, please explain in the comments so I can understand. Gantz, of course, is the current Defense Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister. And under the coalition agreement of the outgoing government, he would have replaced Netanyahu as Prime Minister in October of this year. But let's be real. There were always going to be early elections once the pandemic ended. Was forming a government a selfless move to keep Israel united through a global humanitarian crisis? Probably. Was it also political suicide? You bet! Before entering politics, Gantz was the chief of staff of the Israel Defense Forces, and quite easily swept into politics as part of a long and honestly outdated tradition of politicians and media figures holding up the rank of general as an automatic stepping stone to the office of prime minister. These are no longer the grand foundational figures that led our parents and grandparents to victory in a big existential war for Israel's survival, but the expectation hasn't really caught up with the historical reality. But as there are social democrats, so too must there be democratic socialists. We can't live with each other, we can't live without each other, and Meretz, led by Nitzan Horowitz, is a democratic socialist party which supports a two-state solution, a stronger social safety net, less privatization, more economic regulation, and an end to religious coercion. If that sounds too much like the Social Democrats for you, there are genuine philosophical differences between them, but with Meretz, it's really more of a difference of who's supporting them. Labor support is more urban, more homogeneously Jewish, and more catered to middle-class professionals, civil servants, and military officers. Whereas Meretz is more rural, more artsy, more mixed between Jews and Arabs, and less military. Though ironically this time, Meretz is the party with a general on its list. Its leader, Nitzan Horowitz, is, I believe, the first openly gay leader of a party with seats in the Knesset. Like so many people we've already discussed, he was previously a journalist, he's a big-time environmentalist, and his biggest controversy probably came in 2009 when he boycotted a visit to the country by Pope Benedict XVI. But this is a country in which Roman Catholics are a tiny fraction of a percent of the population. For me personally, his biggest controversy came in the middle of 2020 when he called for reopening schools in the middle of a pandemic, but hey, that's just me. Which leads us to the joint list, led by Ayman Odeh. 21% of Israelis are Arab, and while historically most of them have voted for mainstream parties, and recently around half still have, the degree to which Arab Israelis have fallen behind the rest of the country socially and economically has led to the growth in popularity of predominantly Arab parties. These parties span a wide variety of ideologies, but in order to maximize their electability, in recent years they have mostly joined up to form the joint list, almost as a protest vote. Right now, the joint list comprises three smaller parties. Hadash, led by Ayman Odeh, is the Communist Party. I don't know what more to say about their beliefs except that they're the only party advocating a true one-state solution, that is, integrating Israel and the Palestinian territories into a single unified state and unified citizenry. As you might expect from a communist party, it does have Jewish members, including one currently sitting in the Knesset, and despite being technically the most left-wing, it is arguably the most mainstream and acceptable of the joint list factions, due in no small part to Odeh's long experience in the Knesset. To their right, I suppose, is the center-left Ta'al, which is just kinda there, and to their left, arguably, is Balad, which is fully a protest party claiming to represent the Palestinian people. It is the least popular of the joint list factions, and arguably the most extreme, to the degree that certain Balad members have made a habit of spreading conspiracy theories and refusing to even be seen with Jewish MKs outside of Knesset functions. But wait, there's one more. As long as the joint list has existed, both Israeli and foreign media have referred to the joint list as a left-wing party. And until now, that hasn't entirely been true because of the inclusion of a party called Raam. Fortunately for pedants everywhere, Raam is running in this election on its own, so let's talk about it. Raam, led by Mansour Abbas, is the flagship party for Israel's Bedouin population. Altogether, they're only 2% of Israel's population, but as a quite socially conservative Islamic party, they enjoy just enough general support in this election that they're hovering around the threshold, so it's a 50-50 chance that they'll win any seats. And those are the 14 major parties competing in the current Israeli election. So what does that mean? Well, in the greater scheme of things, very little will probably change. The polls show a pretty even split between Netanyahu's allies and his opponents. In all likelihood, Netanyahu will fail to get a majority of support, but so will Lapid, and so we'll end up with another hung Knesset and another snap election. But that isn't the whole picture. On the 25th of February, Channel 13 released a poll showing 58% of Israelis think Netanyahu should resign, while only 33% think he should remain in power. And yet that isn't reflected in the fortunes of the parties in this election. That won't change until Netanyahu has to leave office. Not by his own choice, but by that of the Knesset or of the courts. That's the simple fact. So keep the pressure on, because even if this election doesn't produce a viable alternative government, it does matter.